Hi everybody, it's Sue Zimmer and this is the spring 2020 semester. This video will cover several things, but it shouldn't be too long. It will cover the vertebrae, including a typical vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So there's not too many features on the vertebrae to learn, so it shouldn't take too long. So we're going to start with a typical vertebrae, and students often ask me the question, well, what does my teacher mean by a typical vertebrae? Well, what your teacher means is just what features are found on most vertebrae. They have a lot of features in common, even though individual ones might have different names. So when your teacher quizzes you on this, she's probably just going to pick a big, chunky vertebrae, and you're going to pick it up and it will either say name this bone or name this structure. So if it says name this bone, your teacher means what type of vertebrae is this? Is this a thoracic, cervical, or lumbar vertebrae? And we'll cover that a little later on, so I won't introduce it right now. But if your teacher says name this structure, she's just asking you for the typical structures found on the typical vertebrae. She's not asking you to identify what type of vertebrae it is. So let's get started with the structures on the typical vertebrae. First up, you have the body. Right here, that's the body, this big part here. So inside you, this is the most deep part, and this is the most superficial part. This is the part that you could feel if you ran your fingers down your own spine. So that's the body. Then I'll hold it like this, close up. Now, the next one that you're going to identify is the vertebral arch. So if you look inside here in this hole, it looks like a triangle sort of, and the arch is like this upper part of the triangle. So that's the vertebral arch right there. Then you're going to identify this structure, which is the vertebral foramen. So literally this big hole in the middle. And vertebral foramen just means the whole of the vertebrae. So your spinal cord goes through there. That's the vertebral foramen. Next up, you're going to have the spinous process. So the way that I like to do it is pretend that this is some sort of an animal. This one looks a lot like a moose, but some of them look like giraffes and such. So the spinous process is the superficial part that you can feel going down your spine, like I said earlier, and it looks like the nose of our moose. So that is the spinous process. It's coming right at you, this part right here. That's the spinous process. So next up, you are going to have the transverse process. So the transverse process is right here. My fingers are on it. So there's a transverse process here and the transverse process here. Turn it sideways. Here's his nose, okay? His spinous process. Now here's the transverse process. This is a transverse process, and this is a transverse process. So if this was a giraffe or a moose, because it kind of looks like them, the transverse process, those are the antlers of the moose or the giraffe. So that's the transverse process. Next, you have the superior and inferior articular process. Now, basically, what that means is that these are the areas where your vertebrae stack on top of each other. So, let's see if I can show you. I've stacked these two. Might be hard to see on the video, but those are stacked now. Now take them off. You see how this one's stacked on the bottom? Well, if this is a moose, the jowls of the moose, that's the inferior articular process. That's the spot where the one below it stacks onto it. So that's the inferior articular process. It's one on each side. And then up top, looks like the ears of this creature right here, right here. That's the superior articular process. So that's where the next vertebrae will come along and stack on top of him. So that's the superior articular process. This is the inferior articular process. below. Next up, you're going to have the intervertebral foramina. Good news here is the only way that your teacher can label the intervertebral foramina is if they have a stacked set of vertebrae like this. And in our lab currently right now in spring 2020, that is only available if you have the articulated skeleton, the one that is just standing up on its own in lab. So if you are labeling stuff in lab in your exam and it's not on the skeleton that stands up on his own, then you cannot label the intervertebral foramina because you can only see the intervertebral foramina if your vertebrae are stacked. So I'm going to put this through it so you can see. So that's where like the nerves will exit, the stacked vertebrae. But like I said, you can only label it. You see the hole? And I'll take it out now. Right here. You can only label the intervertebral foramina if they're stacked like this. So most of the time in lab, I've never seen it happen that the teacher uses the articulated skeleton, but never say never. But that is the only instance when you can label that. So if it's not of articulated skeleton, do not label anything intervertebral foramina because you can't. The same thing goes for the intervertebral discs. In between each one of these vertebrae, there's a little disc of fibrocartilage, and you can only see that little disc on the articulated skeleton. But if it was here, it would be in this empty space right there. But of course, it's not on this one because it's not articulated. So there's nothing to hold it in there. But the intervertebral disc would be there if it was an articulated skeleton. So again, you can only label that on the skeleton that stands up on his own, which I've never seen happen, but you know, anything's possible. So let's just label different types of vertebrae. This is a cervical vertebrae. Why is this a cervical vertebrae? Well, it has, the easiest way to tell is that it's much smaller than the other ones, and it has these holes in it right here. So cervical vertebrae are the only ones that have this hole in it right here. So that's the easiest way to identify them. Next up, we'll have a thoracic vertebrae. So there's a thoracic vertebrae. Let's see if I can get some shading on it. So the thoracic vertebrae, the way you're going to tell it's a thoracic vertebrae is, to me, anyway, it looks like a giraffe. Let me see if I can get it up close. See, it looks like a giraffe. Any single one of the thoracic vertebrae looks like a giraffe. That's how you know it's thoracic. Even to this day, after years of studying these, I have to remind myself, which one is the giraffe and which one is the moose? It's just so much easier to learn it that way. So then you have the lumbar vertebrae, which is this guy. The way I remember a lumbar vertebrae, it looks like a moose. So it's a big, chunky vertebrae, and they all look kind of moose-ish. Might need to use your imagination a little bit, but that does look like a moose to me when compared to this one, which looks a lot like a giraffe. Giraffe. Moose. All right, so going back to the cervical vertebrae, there's a little bit that you have to be able to identify. There are two cervical vertebrae types that you need to know to be able to say what they are. So it's atlas and axis. So A-T-L-A-S, atlas, and axis, A-X-I-S. You need to be able to tell the difference between a typical cervical vertebrae, the atlas vertebrae, and the axis vertebrae. So first of all, I know this is a cervical vertebrae because it has the two holes there in the transverse process. So I know it's a cervical vertebrae. Second of all, I know that this is an atlas. The reason that I know it's an atlas, A-T-L-A-S, is because it looks like the occipital condyles. If you remember the occipital condyles from the skull, so this just looks like it articulates with the occipital condyles. wouldn't you say? So that's how I know it is an atlas. It looks just like it would articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull. So the next one you need to be able to identify is the axis. So that's AXIS. So I know it's a cervical vertebrae because it has those two holes in it. See them? Only cervical vertebrae have those. So I know that for sure it's a cervical vertebrae. Now I know for sure that it is the axis because the axis is the only cervical vertebrae that has this funky little bump in it. You see that bump? Right here. So that bump tells me that this is the axis, AXIS. Now you need to be able to identify the name of this bump on the axis vertebrae. The name of this bump is the dens, D-E-N-S, dens. So it looks like a tooth, doesn't it? So dens sounds like dental, which makes me think of teeth. So that is the dens right here. So to finish today, pretty easy. You just need to know that this is the sacrum. It's the fused vertebrae here. That's the sacrum. See how it's all fused together? You also need to know the coccyx. Look at how tiny it is. That is the coccyx right there. And that is all that this video will cover. Look forward to more future videos. Thank you.